Hello, and welcome to another NABBW Financial Podcast. I'm here with Pamela J. Sams to discuss our June topic, Retiring Early, Can I Afford to Do It? Welcome to our Zoom call. We're so glad that you joined us for this complex, timely, and possibly confusing topic. During our chat tonight, we'll be discussing the huge trend which has developed over the last 12 months after spending 15 months grappling with the pandemic. We baby boomers, despite the fact that many of us had not previously intended to retire even when we reached traditional retirement age, are suddenly throwing in the towel and choosing to retire early. Who knew? I mean, all this time that we've said, me retire, that's not going to ever happen. I'm healthy, I'm happy, I got to have something fun to do, so I'm going to just keep working. But perhaps like me, you have read many articles about this in the recent months. One about a healthcare worker, which CNBC published recently, was particularly compelling, and I'd like to share it here as an introduction to our call tonight. The story is about a woman named Marianne Sargent, who's 65. She had spent 15 years working as a pharmacy technician at Anna Jacques Hospital in Newburyport, Massachusetts. She wasn't planning to retire from the community hospital for another year or two, but the strains as a frontline healthcare worker became too much, and she retired this past December, a couple of years earlier than she previously planned. She said, I felt like there was no other decision that I could have made at that time. I really didn't want to leave. The article goes on to point out that Sargent wasn't alone in her jump to early retirement. As of the third quarter of 2020, some 28.6 million boomers have said they are now retired from the United States workforce. That's 28.6 million out of a total national boomer cohort of about 71.6. So it's a significant amount of people. And 3.2 million more than those who said they were retired during the same period in 2019, which was, I think, the most recent Pew Research report prior to this year. So one of the people quoted in this article is a man named Paul Gaudio, who's a certified financial planner and wealth planning strategist at Bryn Mawr Trust in Princeton. And he said, maybe for some, they faced their mortality and figured, why am I going back to work if my life expectancy could be curtailed by this pandemic? I'm sure that hit a lot of people, he said. But Sargent's decision to quit, as with the decision of thousands of other healthcare workers that we've heard about in the media, was due to the rigorous demands of working in the healthcare field during the pandemic. Research shows that boomers nationwide share the sentiment of wanting to retire early now, and this is especially true for us women. I read another article on a site called the 19thnews.org, which I think has to do with the 19th Amendment, being women being allowed to vote. And this news article said that we're losing so many healthcare workers to early retirement because post-COVID, they can't shake off their memories of seeing coworkers and patients die. These people had no choice, these healthcare workers, but to be on the front lines. So they weren't able to quarantine and work from home. How can you imagine to have your nurse working from home trying to take care of you? So we realize now that these early retiring healthcare workers were actually suffering from a form of PTSD. And a lot of them, because of their age, think that they're too old to be hired on by a new employer. So I'm sure Pam is going to tell us that that's one reason that some people are retired, but it's not the only reason. And I think once I let Pam talk tonight, that she'll tell us that regardless of the field that we've been working in, Americans are reporting that we expect to work I'll start that sentence again. Americans that say that they expect to work past age 67 have dropped to a low of 32.9% in March, according to a New York Federal Reserve survey. And what's involved with that? The biggest risk of retiring early is that you have to make your savings last longer, said Jude Boudreau, CFP and partner at the Planning Center in New Orleans. He said leaving the workforce too soon may put extra pressure on your investment portfolio, depending on how much you have saved. Now, I do want to give Pam a chance to talk about this this evening because she knows a lot more about it than I do. So before we delve into the actual questions that we'll be covering tonight, let me tell you a little bit about who we are. I'm Ann Holmes, your moderator and the boomer-in-chief of the National Association of Baby Boomer Women, an organization dedicated to educating and empowering women at midlife and beyond. And with me to answer our questions is Pamela J. Sams, CRPC, MBA, BFA. Pam is an expert in personal finance, president of Jackson Sam's Wealth Strategies in Herndon, Virginia, and a monthly guest who covers important information related to money and financial planning. The CFP stands for Chartered Retirement Planning Counselor, and she's also NABBW's Retirement Planning Associate. I have one last bit of business before we can launch into tonight's discussion, and that's for me to play a quick audio clip just to keep us legal. So, of course, it should be here now.
Securities offered through Securities America Incorporated, a registered broker-dealer, member FINRA SIPC. Advisory services offered through Securities America Advisors Incorporated, a SEC registered investment advisory firm. Pamela Sams, investment advisor representative. Jackson Sam's Wealth Strategies, Securities America Incorporated, and all other entities named are separate entities.
Thanks for joining us again tonight, Pam.
Yep, thanks for having me once again. That was a lot. I mean, it's a very interesting topic, especially now. We're in different times, you know, post-COVID, or, you know, we're still, you know, in the throes of the pandemic, but people's views are quite different when it comes to their money, retirement, longevity, mortality, everything under the sun right now. So this has really been, you know, a lot of articles, and that's why, you know, I really decided to do this particular topic, because not only have I seen people early retire, but I've also read recently where people don't want to go back to work full time. You know, they have been used to working from home in the comforts of their home. And if their employers aren't providing that option for them, they would rather quit and relocate to someplace else, or maybe get another job that will allow them to work from home. So the labor force is going to look quite different moving forward post-COVID, just based on the fact that I think a lot of workers have chosen to either do a hybrid situation where you're allowed to work at home more, and or, like you said, like some of the people in the story that you had mentioned, just decided to call it quits altogether and just retire a little bit earlier than they normally would have. Either, like you said, the frontline workers, you know, just really seeing what it looks like from a mortality standpoint. It's like, maybe I don't want to work for the rest of my life and do something different. And or, you know, the one thing is, hey, I want to do something different. So it's going to be quite of a challenge in the labor market, with people leaving, and then maybe some also transitioning to other fields, or doing something quite different.
It's as you said, unprecedented. I don't think you and I ever thought that we would see a pandemic. So I don't know that a lot of the people who strategize about how the future would evolve maybe even thought to look into such a situation. So I think we're kind of plowing new ground, so to speak. We're having to figure things out as we go along. And you covered, sent me a list of 10 points that you'd like to share with us tonight about helping people decide if they can possibly be financially able to retire early. And I think that we have so much to talk about here that I would like to dig right into it right away. And you say that the first thing that we have to touch on, and of course, I think it's kind of like the base that everything else is going to be built on, is what retirement means to you. And I'm sure that with your work, you find retirement doesn't mean the same to everyone.
Yeah, exactly. Everybody has their own vision of what that looks like. It may be continuing to have some type of income, maybe what I call a second act, maybe starting their own business, maybe going to work part-time and not full-time, or really just doing the life of leisure, where they're just doing whatever they want to do whenever they want to do. Right. So, you know, the ultimate thing, you know, with all of the other questions and the thoughts that we were going to address today, really starts with, how is that retirement? What does it look like for you? Because everything else follows after that. You know, do you want to stay in your home? I know we did a call several weeks ago where, you know, do we want to relocate? Do we want to stay in our homes, or do we want to do something different with a retirement community, or just leaving your home altogether? So that also has an impact on where you want to live, is what retirement is going to look like, and then how much you're going to ultimately need in that. But as people start to think about retiring early, there's a lot involved with what does retirement look like for you, plan it out accordingly, write that vision down as clear as possible. And then that's where you initially start the conversation with yourself or the plan that you want regarding retirement.
Well, it's interesting that you say that, because it makes me think of the concept you hear when I had a coach. One of the coaches that I had talked to me about a vision board. And, I think what you're almost telling me is that to think about what retirement means to you, you might have to actually create something like a vision board to pull together pictures of how you see yourself in the world as a retired person.
Yeah, I go through a lot of, it's what I call retirement lifestyle. It's similar to the vision board, but it's similar. It's the retirement vision lifestyle type situation. So what are you doing? What type of things that you want to accomplish in retirement? What does that look like? Like I said, do you want to continue to work, maybe part-time, having the option, starting the business or the passion project you always wanted to do when you were working, but didn't have all of the hours in the day that you do now as a retiree. So that looks quite different for everyone. So really starting with, like you said, maybe a vision board on what is that retirement lifestyle going to look like for you.
Okay. And then once you've started visioning what retirement means to you, then you have to start building the bricks that allow you to make that picture actually happen. And the first thing that you have on the list after questioning what retirement means to you is you got to look at your savings.
Yes, that's going to determine how much money that you have in retirement. So where are you with how much you've saved so far for retirement? Because once you write that vision down, it's really how are you going to pay for it? Right. That's what it comes down to. What money do you have? What type of resources do you have saved up for retirement? So, whatever that number may be, that will determine if you can afford to retire or not, or it will curb what actually that vision looks like. You can put down kind of your dream scenario. I always tell people to dream big, and then we can kind of scale it down to see what's more reasonable in that situation. And that may be determined based on how much you have saved for retirement as well. If you don't have enough, then that may be something where you want to continue to work, maybe part-time, bringing in some type of income, but having a little bit more flexibility with that. But you need to take an assessment of what your savings program looks like for retirement, and then curb what your vision is based on how much you've saved so far.
Excellent. Now, just a question for you. My observation is that sadly, boomers haven't saved the amount that financial advisors like yourself would have hoped that they would save. Is that an accurate observation, or am I off base with that?
No, I mean, I think a lot of people are behind the curve when it comes to their actual retirement savings. I have some people that I meet with, some clients that initially come to me. It's like, I think like what you had mentioned before, I don't know if I'm ever going to be able to retire because I just don't have enough, or I started a little bit later, or I had a life circumstance that may have determined, you weren't able to save enough, or it could have set you back, had a life situation where that could have happened, and then you don't have enough for that. So a lot of boomers are behind the curve when it comes to retirement savings. So that would impact if you're able to afford to retire earlier based on how much you have saved so far.
Okay. Then once you've analyzed what availability you have in terms of savings, I think you're going to tell me that the next step that you really have to face and analyze is budget.
Yes, that's our favorite topic.
It's our favorite topic, but that's why I said I think that's what you're going to tell
every
me.
conversation always circles back around to your budget, because that's going to determine how much you can live off of. You know, with any scenario, you have what money that you have coming into your household and then money that's going out. Basically, whatever your cash flow is, your cash management system, income, and then expenses. And then based on that, you know, what is your budget for retirement? So, you know, if it takes $60,000, let's say, for example, to live off of in retirement, to have an efficient retirement, are you going to be able to maintain the lifestyle that you want? Number one, consistently bring in that amount, because sometimes, you know, depending on where your assets are, it could fluctuate. But then also, what are you spending your money on? You know, so I always stress, especially with people who are looking at retirement, either early retirement or a traditional, you know, maybe 65 or 67 year, 65, 66 or 67, is you need to understand how much it takes to run your household, because you're not going to get that bi-weekly paycheck anymore.
Right.
You are going to create that your own paycheck, where either you're getting Social Security, or you're taking money from IRAs, or you have a pension, whatever the case may be. You are generating that paycheck on a monthly basis. So you're not going to get paid every 2 weeks. It'll probably be once a month from a variety of different resources. And then how much money is going out. So you know pretty much what's going to be coming in. The only other factor that you really have control over is how much is going out on a month-to-month basis. And that's where your budget comes from. So it starts with kind of a needs and a wants analysis, the things that you need. Of course, we need to eat. So food, shelter, and transportation, generally healthcare, would be those things that we absolutely need. And then on another category, I always have kind of a T-chart exercise I use with my clients, is that kind of the needs. And then on the other side of that equation is the wants. So, you know, I want to take a trip once a year, or I want a new car every 3 or 4 years, or I want, you know, to take the grandkids on a big vacation or a family vacation, whatever that is, that would be kind of the wants. And then we have to see, you know, based on what you have coming into the household, are those needs and wants, is it covered with what you're bringing in? And if not, then maybe we need to curb some of the wants, some things that either you can eliminate or reduce, or, you know, find a different way to take care of those wants. So that's where you need to focus in on with the budget part of it, is how much is coming in, how much is going out. Are there ways to reduce, eliminate, or you know, change the want in that particular scenario? But it's ever so important, especially, like I said, for retirees, because you don't have that constant every 2 weeks paycheck coming in. You have to devise a strategy around that once a month paycheck, either through Social Security, pensions, or, you know, money coming from your IRA, in order to devise your retirement income. And that depends on how much is going out, and that's going to determine how much you can afford to live off of. And that also determines if you get able to retire early based on that.
All right. And that totally makes sense. Now, the Marianne Sargent, the woman that I discussed earlier, I didn't obviously read the whole article to everyone, but one of the things that she said is that she was able to retire early because she had no debt. So debt or no debt is the next point that we have to talk about.
Exactly. And preferably, you know, like Ms. Sargent, would be no debt. Because, you know, if you have monies that are going towards servicing debt, that's money that you can be using in your household for extra expenses besides, you know, servicing debt. Of course, there's good debt and bad debt. You know, sometimes people say, you know, if you have your mortgage and you have, you know, student loans or any of those, can be considered, because you have an asset there with your home, student loans. You're getting the education out of it. But, you know, and I get this question all the time is, do I pay off my mortgage or do I keep my mortgage? It really just depends. You know, a lot of times people look at having a tax deduction from the mortgage interest. Some people don't want to have a mortgage because they don't want to have that debt obligation for a mortgage. So it's a case by case situation. I don't always say absolutely pay it off or not. I would have to look at, you know, individual person's situation. But the thing is with no debt is looking at consumer debt. So if you have massive credit card debt, or you know you're chunking away at it that way, the likelihood of having an early retirement and still having a large amount of consumer debt is probably very low, because you have a large portion of your income going towards debt servicing. So in that example that I use, if you have 60,000 of income that you need to live off of, that's roughly $5,000 a month, and you got 1,000 going to debt servicing, that only really leaves you with 4 to live off of. That's not going to be, you know, you would have to work the numbers accordingly. But if you didn't have the debt, then you have that extra $1,000 in your budget to, you know, live off of. So the best case scenario is to try to have little or no debt when you're looking at either, of course, a traditional retirement, but especially looking at an early retirement, because you just really can't afford to have any extra resources going to servicing debt. You need that in your pocket in order to run your household.
Okay, that totally makes sense to me. And it's something you and I, like budget, we talk about paying down the debt, and you know, if we've been able to do that, obviously this is when it makes the decision that you want to retire early possible. So excellent. If we find ourselves in that situation, and otherwise we'll have to make adjustments. Next point on your list of excellent things that we need to consider if we want to retire early is accessibility of savings.
Exactly. So this is a little bit different than just regular, making sure you have enough in savings, of course, is, are they accessible? And I had this conversation actually the other day with a client who, you know, she's a little bit younger. So every time I speak with young people, you know, that 65 age retirement looks like so far away. They want to get retired at, you know, 50, 55. And I have to have with them the conversation of accessibility of your assets. So depending on how much you have saved and where it is, that will affect if you have access to them. So with IRA money, for example, or 401k money, or anything that was pre-taxed in your pre-tax bucket, you really are not allowed to, you know, the tax law is built that you can't access those funds until you're 59 and a half. So with looking at an early retirement prior to 59 and a half, do you have resources that will be able to fill the gap before you can tap into your pre-tax money, the IRAs or the 401k or 403b, if you're, you have one of those. That's kind of what I mean by the accessibility of the assets. So if you're thinking about early retirement and the only thing you do have is money in a pre-tax bucket, those 401ks and IRAs, where else will you be able to tap into to make to bring in income for yourself? So do you have, you know, a separate maybe brokerage account where there's stocks or mutual funds or other investments? Do you have, you know, equity in your home that maybe you can, you know, tap into if you need it? You know, selling of assets, that extra business, if you have a business that you are bringing in income. So it's really, where are your assets located, and can I get to them in order to make up my retirement income? Now, there is, you know, something in the tax rules that you are allowed to take money depending on what your employer, if your employer is, if it's written in their plan and they're open to it, is you can access it at age 55, but it's a special situation called a, I think it's a special, it's called SEPP, which means it's a systematic equal payment, periodic payments. So between 55 and 59 and a half, the tax law said you can get at it, and it also has to deal with your employer having it available, but you can retire at 55, but you do need between 55 and 59 and a half, take a systematic equal periodic payment each year to make up the income. It is basically a written contract, so you do have to follow the whole, 4 to 5 years within that time period. If you mess it up at all, IRS is not going to like it too much, and they're going to come back and say, hey, you didn't do it right. And then they're going to tax, basically everything that you took outside of that, like it was a 59 and a half. But if it was prior to 59 and a half, and tax you that way, plus the income. So you would get the penalty and you would have to claim income. So you don't want to do that. But if you know that you want to retire early at least 55, you can invoke a SEPP, systematic equal periodic payments, between that time period. That will give you the accessibility to your IRAs, your 401ks, all of that pre-tax money that I just talked about.
Okay, so what I'm curious about is, say you decide now, whether you're 55 or if you're 65, that you, like I had really planned to never retire because I think I would be bored. So I always think that I have to be doing something as long as I have my health to allow myself to do that. So say I'm me and I'm over 65, but I decide, oh, I've got to change my plans. How much time will it take a person to actually turn things into the situation that you're talking about, so you have your savings accessible and those sorts of situations? I know that's not on your list of questions, but I'm just curious about it.
Yeah, the turnaround time, if you're prior to age 55, is that what you meant? Or,
yes.
Yeah.
Well,
yeah, you would have to, start thinking about it maybe, about a year, maybe a year in advance, if that's what you plan on doing. So you can go ahead and get it set up with your employer to be able to access it. This is if you have a 401k, that's usually through your plan document, through your HR department to set those up. But give them some time to really put the contract in place. Of course, you have to give notice, hey, I'm leaving, or I'm resigning from this position. So that normal time period that you would have to do so to be released from your employer. But you want to start thinking about it at least a year in advance, if that's what you want to do at age 55. So make sure you set everything up properly, and then you'll have the income sources at that point.
All right. Next point on your list starts going in a slightly different direction, is housing plans. Obviously, housing is one of the things that you mentioned, the three most important things that we need to have. But we haven't really talked about housing situation yet.
Yeah, and that's, comes back also down to, do you want to pay off your mortgage, or do you not want to pay off your mortgage? Do you want to relocate? Do you want to downsize? Like I said, we had this conversation, several calls ago, where we talked about, continuing to live in your kind of age in place versus moving someplace else. But that has a huge impact of whether you're going to retire early, even in a traditional retirement. Is what is your lifestyle? Are you going to live in the same area? Would you live in the same area you are now, or when you retire, move someplace else? I live right outside of the Washington, D.C. area. It's a fairly expensive area to live in, and that would dictate how much resources that I would need in order to make my retirement income, versus if I had moved away, maybe someplace different. I have clients that move away to cheaper places like Florida or North Carolina and those other places. And then that way, it may not take as much annual income to live in those areas versus if you live in a large metro area where the cost of living is a bit higher with that. So when you're determining if you want to retire early, housing comes in is a big consideration, because that dictates where you're going to live, how much you have to allocate if you have a mortgage or if you're going to pay off a mortgage prior. But if you want to stay and age in place in your current property and you have your mortgages either fairly low or you're almost paid off, then it may be doable with that. If it's a long period of time where you're in a 30-year mortgage and you still have quite a way to go, that's also a big debt obligation that you have. Is there a different way that you can reduce your living expenses, either downsize, rent out, do something a little bit different? But evaluating your living situation is one of the considerations that you do need to think about when you want to do early retirement.
All right. Now, going back to another, Liza, you keep saying some of our earlier conversations, I think that we had a discussion about the concept of moving, and there's a lot of implications to moving. For one thing, you lose all the friends that you have spent so much time with. But I'm thinking of a situation with a friend of mine that I've known since junior high, that she had lived in Colorado, and somehow in her family, she was designated the child to take care of her mother.
Okay.
So her father had previously died, and so her mother was a widow, and she lived in Colorado because that's where her mother was living, and her job was living with her mother and being her caregiver and taking care of her. When the time came for her mother to die, she moved to North Carolina. I think that she must have thought, well, Colorado's great if you like to ski and if you like mountains and that sort of thing. But she wanted to move to North Carolina, so she bought a house there. And I'm not making this up, but she hated North Carolina. I was so amazed, but she had left all of her people that she knew. She had lost her mother. She moved to this state in a lovely house. I saw the pictures of the house. But within 6 months, she had moved to Maine because that was where her family was originally from.
Yeah.
And so do you have in the people that you work with, people that move, change their housing and then they're totally unhappy with, or is my friend a unique situation?
Yeah, I mean, I hear it and I see it a lot. I wouldn't say maybe a lot, but there are circumstances where people end up like, okay, this is not my cup of tea or what I thought. I had one client who did something similar. She hasn't quite made that decision yet. I think it's gotten better, but initially she moved again to North Carolina. I don't know what it is about it.
Right.
But she had thought maybe this wasn't the right decision for me. But since then she's had gotten a new job, made some friends, and those sort of things. But she was seriously contemplating either relocating back up this way or moving to a different location than moving closer to family, so to speak, is what she was thinking about. So what happens? That was one of the calls we talked about before, is trying to at least live in the area for a little bit, for at least an extended period of time to get a feel for it before you actually kind of up and move, because sometimes that can be a little bit costly, relocating to different areas if you're unhappy at some point, to really try to evaluate as much as you can. But yeah, it happens, definitely.
Oh, no, I understand that it must happen, but the thing that I thought about, and I tried to see all the sides for her, but I thought she bought a home and then she's trying to sell this home within 6 months of buying it. And everything I've ever heard about home buying, and I have been a home buyer for many years, I support home buying, but I don't think you make out very well when you buy a home and have to sell it within 6 months. I think that's
that tends not to work out as much, but in this housing market that we're in now, everything is
this is
so
crazy
hot.
housing market right now.
So it could make out very well in a 6-month period in a market like this, but traditionally probably not. But sometimes people get so unhappy that they're willing to go ahead and take the loss on it, versus stay in a situation where it may not work out, or they're totally unhappy. And it was, like I said, with my client who moved to North Carolina and decided to stay. She would have taken a loss if she had moved during the time that she was considering that, and she was,
Mhm.
okay with that. It wasn't like a huge loss,
Right.
but it was something that she had considered quite a bit, and I was glad that at least she made a different decision. A job came through for her because the frustration was also not getting employment right away, and then not
Mhm.
having a support system, friends or family. But ultimately, she was able to make that work out. So that's what you really look at is it's not ideal to move and then within a short window of time, within a 6 to 12 month period, sell again. But like I said, if you're totally unhappy and you're okay with taking the loss, just know
Right.
it's not ideal situation. I generally don't recommend it, but you have to do for your sanity.
Right.
Some things you have to take bite the
Well,
bullet, I guess.
and you're correct about the craziness of the housing market right now. I just can't believe when I'm hearing that people are paying more than the asking price, and
Yeah.
houses are turning around in days or weeks from listing. And I think
Mhm.
I read that the median house sale price at this point is 350,000, which I don't know what the median price used to be, but I think that's a lot higher than I would have guessed the average houses. Uh,
Yeah, it's quite a bit, and I know clients as well as friends who are realtors, and things are going much more over list. Even for example, one of my clients who recently moved up to Massachusetts. She retired from here. She was originally from that area, so she moved up that way,
mhm.
and for quite some time she had to lease. And well, she wasn't leasing; she was staying in a hotel. She was staying in a residence inn for a couple of months because she just couldn't find a house up there. And then eventually she did, but it was probably about 50 to 60,000 over list, just ordered to be competitive in that area. And it
Mhm.
was about 3 to 4 bids on that particular property, and she just happened to win the bid. So that's where we are with the housing market. And what I read before is that it's no time soon does anyone see it cooling off at all.
Fascinating. I had not realized, I had not investigated when it might cool down,
Yeah.
but I guess it's a great market for realtors.
Yes,
Yes.
definitely.
Yes. All right. Next on your list is a thing that I think we really, it's as critical as all the other points, but again, going in a little bit of different direction, and that's longevity. And I think by that you mean how long do we anticipate that we will live?
Yeah, I know that's not one of those things that we have a crystal ball and we know right away. But that's one of the questions I always ask people is, is there longevity in your family? Are there
Mhm.
people living into their 90s or hundreds? If you have pretty good genes, then the likelihood of that happening, and to you is a possibility. So you have to
Mhm.
kind of work that into your game plan. That's the same thing when we talked about, in several calls as well. Longevity comes health issues.
Mhm.
So, what's your healthcare cost going to be eventually in retirement? The Medicare costs, the long-term care costs, going back and forth to doctors, having good access to good medical care. That was one of the things we talked about as well when you're looking for different housing. Are you close to a facility where you can be seen right away without having to wait?
Mhm.
So longevity, I want to call it, kind of healthcare overall in there, but you have to kind of think about the longevity is that's going to affect if you retire early, just like in your story, you have a long life ahead of you.
Mhm.
Traditionally, if you look at age 65 or 66, when I do planning for my clients, it's about a 25 to 30-year retirement. So just to think if you were to retire much earlier than that, tack on another, 10 or 20 years prior. So if you retire, let's say in your 50s, you've added 10 more years on that. And so now you're planning for probably a 40-year retirement. So, and if you live much longer, you're going to have to let those dollars stretch even more. So that's one of the things you do need to consider. Like I said, you don't have a crystal ball. You don't know what that's going to happen, but you do need to plan for, a longer retirement than even the traditional 35 to 30-year retirement.
Well, that certainly makes sense, and especially with the medical advances that we're seeing, that is
Yes.
helping people to live longer as well. So, but all right, so I have both of my parents living in their 90s, so I guess you're going to tell me that I should think that probably bodes that something of that nature is in my future. So
yeah, and my mother just turned 90 in December. So, my father had passed away. I think I shared the story with you before, 2001. He was only 70. But then he did have some health issues that was related to his passing. But my mother has turned 90, so I have to probably plan for a longer retirement as well.
Okay, well, that's the reason why when I used to go to the fitness center, and I'm probably getting back there this month, but when I used to go to the fitness center, I would be fascinated listening to the people talking when we were at the fitness center. And I would hear these guys talking about retiring early, and I'm looking at them and they're looking really, really fit. And I'm thinking, why do you want to retire early? Because you're talking about, I look forward to retiring because I'll have nothing that I have to do. And I'm thinking, but nothing that you have to do for 40 years is going to be really boring.
Yeah, it's quite boring.
All
That's
right.
true. That's true.
But generally, longevity is on the upswing for all of us. Although I've started seeing some headlines that saying we boomers aren't maybe living as long as our parents are going to live, but maybe that's because we're not paying as good attention to our health. But that leads to point number 8, healthcare.
Yes, exactly. And I probably jumped the gun a little bit and kind of combined the two, but that's what you need to consider with healthcare is, the Medicare costs that I mentioned before. If you're living much longer with the longevity, at some point you may need or have a long-term care situation occur. So you have to plan accordingly. That's going to take up a lot. The last statistic I saw, Fidelity did a study a couple of years ago, and they had estimated about $250,000. This is just healthcare costs, in the life of a, let's say if you retire at 65, that 25 to 30-year retirement I talked about, you're probably going to need an extra $250,000 just for medical costs and, Medicare premiums and all of those. And that doesn't even account long-term care. So, a lot of times when I do presentations and I include that particular stat, most people are looking like, where am I going to come up with another $250,000 or $300,000 outside of what I say for retirement, just for healthcare? So that's one of the things to consider if you do, retire early. The other thing is, do you have access to a healthcare plan? Most of the time, people age into Medicare at a traditional retirement. If you're looking at 65, 66, you're aged into Medicare and you have an option. If you retire prior to aging into Medicare, will you have access to healthcare? Most of the time, you have an employer plan.
Right.
If you come off an employer plan, if you retire early, how are you going to fill that gap? You're basically at that point responsible for your own health insurance, which could be quite costly if you have it outside of a group and you haven't aged into Medicare yet. So, if you retired 50 or 55, you basically have, let's say 50, you have 15 years before you're eligible for Medicare. You have to pay for health insurance for the next 15 years out of pocket, out of your income. So that can be a huge premium that you didn't account for. That's one of the things you need to really think about if you want to retire early is, do I have access to health care? Will I have access to health care? I haven't aged into Medicare yet. How am I going to fill the gap?
Exactly. Before the Affordable Care Act was passed, Um, Steve and I, being self-employed, we had to finance our own health insurance because they didn't have any groups that were really beneficial if you're just a 2 or 3 person company. So
Yeah.
I remember before the Affordable Care Act passed, we got to a point where I was so thankful that the ACA passed, because otherwise we were looking at that our health insurance was going to cost more than our mortgage. And I thought, how upside down is that? That
Yeah.
just my health insurance, not even what I might actually have to pay for treatments, but just the insurance
Yeah.
part of it
That's the
was going to
insurance.
be bigger than my mortgage, which I normally think, is one of people's largest monthly
Yeah,
expenses. So
exactly.
healthcare, if you do not age into Medicare, is something that people really might not be aware of, how much
Yeah,
healthcare costs. Health.
exactly. And I think we're a little bit sheltered because it's
Mhm.
just coming out of our paychecks generally. If we work for an employer, we're a W-2 employer. Both of us as our own business owners, we're aware that we do
Mhm.
have to cover our own healthcare costs. So we're a little
Right.
more cognizant of it. But for the average person, if they come off of a credible employer plan, all of a sudden, and most of the time that's subsidized through the employer. You will see your
Mhm.
premium come out of your paycheck. It may be, a quarter of what the actual cost is to the employer, because the employer is subsidizing some of that. But without that, you're responsible for the whole premium. It gets to be a little bit costly.
Mhm.
I had a client who's so self-employed. She just recently aged into Medicare over the past year and a half. She was so happy because it basically cut her premiums almost, in half
Mhm.
from what she was paying, like you said, almost close to a mortgage payment for her premiums for having being self-employed and have to cover her own health care. Then agent to Medicare, she was able to, free up almost $800 a month just from healthcare costs.
Absolutely true, and something that we want people to be aware of as we're
Mhm.
covering these points of whether we can afford to retire early. Point number 9, uh, filling your time. That's
Yeah.
uh,
And
that's the
that's what you
one,
had just mentioned. That's where we
right?
thought we were going to is how are you filling your time? A
Hmm.
lot of times people go, yeah, I can do whatever I want to, but for 40 years, what are you
Hmm.
doing? That's why I go through kind of that vision that I talked about initially is what are you doing? I
Hmm.
always go kind of through this exercises, day one, retirement, the alarm goes off. You don't have any place to go because,
Hmm.
usually you get the alarm or you're not even setting the alarm. You just wake up. What are you doing with those 24 hours? Granted, you're going to sleep some, but what are you doing
Hmm.
during the day? What
Right.
are you filling your time with? There's only so much, trips and golf and all of these different things that you can do, so that happened to my sister. She retired early. She had as a government worker, as long as you have your 20 plus years in, you're
Right.
eligible for pension. And so she was able to retire. I believe she was 53 or 54 at the time. And then she stayed retired all of about maybe 2.5 years. She got bored. Now she's volunteering. She was volunteering. Now she has a paid position as more kind of a caregiver in one of the local nursing homes in St. Louis. But she was going stir crazy
Hmm.
for 2.5 years on what do I do? It's only
Hmm.
so much soap operas I can watch, or TV shows, or Netflix, or all of those things. So that goes back to writing that vision out as well. Is that I know a lot of times people focus on the dollars part of retirement, and that's what I help people with specifically. But I also make them write out what are you going to be doing, because that's the
Hmm.
second piece of retirement. Is that now you have kind of quote unquote a life of leisure. How are you filling your time though? You also have to stay fairly active. You don't want to be in a situation where you're at home all the time. Of course, we had to when you're in quarantine, but
Hmm.
you don't want that all the time as a retiree. So you want to make sure you put in sometimes where you're traveling or you're are volunteering, or maybe that part-time job, or helping in the neighborhood, something that you're doing to keep active,
Mhm.
because that can also affect your longevity. Because you've heard statistics that people who don't have a whole lot to do end up kind of wasting away,
They do.
because they just don't know what to do with their lives, or they're just not very active, and they become kind of a hermit situation, and then it's downhill from there. So you need to write out what types of things you're going to be filling your time with in retirement. And if you're doing it early, definitely know what you're going to do for, let's say, a retirement. There's only so much, you said those guys in the gym, we're talking about retiring early. There's only so much gym time you can
Right.
do.
Right.
There's only so many times you can go to the gym. You could be definitely extra fit, and that
Mhm.
sort of thing. But you have to do something else. So that goes along with that vision that we talked about in the beginning, is how you're filling your time in retirement.
Excellent. And something that I think a lot of people don't think about in terms of like the 40 years that you're talking about. They just think about, oh, I can't wait because I won't have to go to work. My time is my own. But
Mhm.
but if you don't have the strategic plans like you're talking about of what you're going to do, um, after a while it becomes um, just almost like a albatross around your neck is I don't have anything to do.
Yeah, exactly. And I think it's one of those things, I guess, too much of a good thing,
Right, right.
sometimes it's like, yeah, okay, I have all this free time now, but what am I doing with it?
Hmm.
So that's kind of what people need to focus in on, especially if you're going to retire early. So a lot of times people do like what I call the second act. Maybe they start a business, or, they help out in the community, or, they volunteer at the local school. I have a lot of, when my kids were in school, even though they didn't have kids in school, it was a lot of, parents who used to have kids in the school, but they would volunteer their time for the sports program or the boosters program, because it gave them something to do. They had plenty of time to go and make meals for the team, or, work concessions and do all of these different things. So, even getting involved to that capacity, but it gives you a purpose and something to do.
Hmm. And for those of us who were working when our kids were in school, we don't have really the time to do
Correct.
that work that they're doing, the volunteer work that make all those sports programs and everything
Hmm.
run. So
Yep.
it's a very good community resource for these
Hmm.
people to do those
Yeah.
sorts of things.
Or you can decide to teach. Speaking with one
Hmm.
of my clients, my long time clients earlier, and since he's retired, he teaches a couple of courses. He loves genealogy, so he teaches genealogy at one of the local community colleges programs, and it gives him something to do. And he's still very active in Scouts program, because his kids, even though they're older now, he's with his grandkids doing Scouts. But he volunteers and does trips all the time, and go to the conferences with the Boy
Hmm.
Scouts. So that's really, and even before he was retired, he was very active in that. So he's just continued it even on a greater capacity now, because he has more time.
Right.
So those are some of the things you have to consider, is how do you feel your time in retirement?
Hmm. And point number 10 on your list is kind of summing up what all we've said is have a plan.
Yeah. So, that it comes down to writing everything out as detailed as possible, going through the 9 points that we talked about. So, starting up towards, what does that retirement look like for you? And then it goes down to getting to know all of those numbers.
Hmm.
How much does it take to run your household? That's one of those questions I ask people a lot. And you would be surprised on the amount of people who actually know that number. So it becomes ever so important, as you think about retiring early, to know all of the numbers, where all of the assets are they accessible?
Hmm.
What your savings look like. Do I have debt that I need to pay off prior to retiring? Do I want to keep my mortgage? Where am I going to live? All of those things will be in your financial plan, so the numbers work out and you're able to afford to retire. The worst thing is that you retire and you didn't do any planning. Ultimately, you'll end up going back to work. I think it's always a running joke that eventually you'll end up as a Walmart greeter because it didn't work out right. And now you have to make a little extra income someplace.
Hmm.
And that's kind of where the planning comes into place, is that you want to make sure you do that prior to just making that hasty decision to say, okay, I'm done. I want to retire early and go, you know, resign tomorrow. You need to do the homework first
Right.
to make sure the numbers work out, because you don't want to get out there and then all of a sudden it doesn't work out. And then you have to go back to work. That may be self-defeating for you and your ego. So you
Hmm.
want to make sure you do some planning first.
Very good. Well, that's the list of the 10 questions that you provided, and I thank you for
Mhm.
pulling together the list and giving us the answers. We do have a couple of questions that
Mhm.
have come here, and I think that they might be interesting to share. So
Okay.
the first one is a person wondering whether or not moving out of the country, becoming an expat, is an advisable way to help her allow her current level of limited savings to better match up to her anticipated lifetime.
Mhm. Yeah, no, I think we did a call several years ago on expat finances,
Mhm.
and it's doable, and it is one of the solutions. May not be the only solution, but it is a lot involved as well with deciding to be an expat. What's going to happen with your Social Security, your medical situation, all of those. So the same amount of work goes into planning the same way. If you decide you want to, become an expat, live overseas, there's a lot involved with making sure you know all of the ins and outs of how that works.
Mhm.
But that could be a solution to reduce your cost of living significantly. And I think we talked a little bit about that before, about relocating and housing. Is that, again, if you are going to become an expat, you want to visit the country you're thinking about, because
Mhm.
the grass is not always greener sometimes, and the luxuries that we have here in the U.S. Are quite different than some countries that you may want to consider living in that will be cheaper, but it may not have the comforts that you want. So it's going to take, again, a lot of planning, a lot of research, making sure you make the proper decision for yourself.
I would definitely agree with that. I think that uh, it's like taking times 10 the concept of moving, because
Yes.
now if something happens to some member of your family that you want to come home and be with them, it's not like, oh, I have to drive 6 hours to get to where my family lives. It's like I have to get on a plane and
Yeah.
fly and there I've heard and read lots of people that say the expat lifestyle is wonderful, but I think what you are saying is correct, that you really have to do
Hmm.
study what the country is going to be like, and
Hmm.
understand and go and visit for a couple of months, and do that at different times of the year. Don't just
Yeah.
go during
Exactly.
um, summer or winter, because their seasons might might make a big difference in whether you
Mhm.
actually like living there or not.
Exactly. Yep. That's true.
Our second questioner says that she's willing to consider setting up some kind of home-based business, as you
Hmm.
mentioned, to augment her lack of savings, but she knows that she needs to avoid scams, and that self-employment doesn't get her the benefits or a reliable income. So she's curious if there's a resource that you recommend to your clients, to help them figure out how to translate their skills into an income source.
Hmm. Hmm. Well, there's a lot of what people are calling kind of gig work or side hustles these days. Really just trying to match your skill set with something that's out there. Those I won't recommend it, but a lot of gig work, driving Ubers and stuff like that, would may be a possibility if you drive.
Mhm.
There's a lot of medical transcription services. So if you're really good at data entry and some of those skills, there's a lot of community colleges or some of these programs that can retool or retrain people who want, kind of these, what I call hot areas. I know medical transcription is really big right now, especially as they're trying to convert a lot of the medical records to electronic and digitizing them. So that may be something that you can utilize your skills with. But a lot of the kind of the career and community colleges, just to kind of do some research on some of the areas that are kind of hot right now, that may translate or match your skills. If not, are you willing to get retooled or retrained in some of these programs as well? I know in our area, if you're looking at home-based businesses as well, there's always the local economic development center in your county or your state that may be able to give you some guidance as well on where to look for some of these things, and also have programs where you can retrain and retool for some of these jobs that are kind of hot in the market now.
All right. Well, that sounds like very good help for her question. As usual, it's been great talking with you, Pam, and I want to thank you for another great Zoom call and for providing us with this excellent and thoughtful advice on why we might or might not be able to afford to retire early. For our listeners, I want to remind them that our next discussion will be Thursday, July 22nd at the same 8 p.m. Eastern, 7 p.m. Central Time. And of course, you audience, I hope you're liking that we're doing Zoom calls, because it will be another Zoom call. And Pam and I hope that you'll join us then. Is there anything else, Pam, that you'd like to add before we wrap up this call?
I think we covered everything. But like I said, if we were to think of anything, number one, which would be what does the vision look like? And then number 10, which would be the plan part of it. So, all of the other things are things to consider, but those are kind of the two most important things to think about when you want to think about retiring early.
All right. So as Pam has said, if you have questions that you want to confer with her about later, you can feel free to email Pam at pamela@jacksonsams.com. That's JACKSONSAMS.com, or her website, which has lots of excellent information, is jacksonsams.com. And if you'd like to know more about the National Association of Baby Boomer Women, you can check out our website at nabbw.com. We have a forum at boomerwomenspeak.com and a Facebook page at facebook.com/nabbw, where I try to keep articles. I post articles that I find that are related to topics that I think baby boomer women would be interested in. I've posted many in the past week that have had to do with retiring early, and I will be sure to continue to post any articles that I find pertaining to that. And I have also posted some articles that Pam has sent. So be sure to not neglect the facebook.com/nabbw, because there's always changing information that's posted at that location. So it's a good resource, as of course is the jacksonsams.com website. So thank you everyone for Zooming with us tonight. And I think we're going to say good night.
Okay, great. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.